Okay, so we're here with mixing percentages and EMs. In 15 we specified margins in a combination of percentage value and EMs. This is actually common in contemporary web development, particularly for creating fluid layouts that respond to the size of the viewport. Okay. Some developers use percentages for all horizontal measurements, so they are relative to the viewport size. Okay, but use EM for all vertical measurements because it is in keeping with the scale and rhythm of the line of text. This technique is a preference, not a requirement. Okay, that then we have warning: be careful mixing fluid columns with borders. It is usually best if your percentages add up to less than 100% to accommodate the border width. Okay, 64% and all. Okay, if they are used and to accommodate rounding errors that browsers sometimes make. If too many column widths are rounded up, the columns may be calculated as too wide for the browser and you'll get a dreaded float drop. Okay, positioning basics. CSS provides several methods for positioning elements on the page. They can be positioned relative to where they would normally appear in the flow, or removed from the flow altogether and placed at a particular spot on the page. Okay. You can also position an element relative to the browser window, technically known as viewport, and it will stay put while the rest of the page scrolls. Okay. So we have position, static, relative, absolute, fixed. Okay. The position property indicates that an element The position property indicates that an element is to be positioned. Yeah. The position property indicates that an element is to be positioned and specifies which positioning method to use. I'll introduce each keyword value briefly here. Then we'll make. Okay. We have static. Default is static. This is the normal positioning scheme in which elements are positioned as they occur in the normal flow of the document. Okay. Relative positioning moves the box relative to its original position in the flow. The distinctive behavior of the relative positioning is that the space the element would have occupied in the normal flow is preserved as an empty space. Okay, moves the box relative. Yeah, I would need examples. Okay, relative positioning moves the box relative to its original position. Okay, okay, got it. Relative to it. So if then go if it is relative to +6, so this space will be empty and it will go 6. Okay, absolutely positioned elements are removed from the document flow entirely and positioned with respect to browser window or a containing element. We'll talk more about this later. Unlike relatively positioned elements, the space they would have occupied is closed up. In fact, they have no influence at all on the layout of surrounding elements. Then we have fixed. The distinguishing characteristic of fixed positioning is that the element stays in one position in the window even when the document scrolls. Okay. Fixed elements are removed from the document flow and positioned relative to the browser window or other viewport rather than another element in the document. It currently causes some hiccups on mobile devices. Okay. Each positioning method has its purpose, but absolute positioning is most versatile. With absolute positioning, you can place an object anywhere in the viewport or within another element. Absolute positioning can be used to create multi-column layouts, but it is more commonly used for small tasks like positioning a search box in the top corner of a header. And you can also use absolute positioning to break an image or chunks out of it or chunk out of its containing box, creating hanging creating hanging indents or overlap effects. It's a handy tool when used carefully. Okay, specifying positions. So once we have established the positioning method, The actual position is specified with 4 offset. Okay. Again we have the trouble. Okay. The values for each of the offset defines the distance of the element. Okay. The value provided for each of the offset properties defines the distance the element should be moved away from the respective edge. Okay. For example, the value of top defines the distance the top outer edge of the positioned element should be offset from the top outer edge of the browser or other containing element. Okay, a positive value for top in the element box moving down. Similarly, a positive value for left would move the positioned element to the right. Okay. So for left, for top, it will go down. Okay, by that amount. Right. Okay, negative values are acceptable and move the element in the opposite direction of the positive value. For example, a negative value of top would have the effect of moving the element up. Further explanations and examples of the offset property will be provided in the discussion for each positioning method. We'll start with the exploration of positioning with fairly straightforward relative method. Okay. Relative positioning. As mentioned previously, relative positioning moves an element relative to its original spot in the flow. The space it would have occupied is preserved and continues to influence the layout of surrounding content. This is easier to understand with a simple example. Here I've positioned an inline EM element. Emphasize. A background color makes its boundaries apparent. Okay. You have position. Like space, as mentioned previously, relative positioning moves an element relative to its original spot in the flow. The space it would have occupied is preserved and continues to influence the layout of surrounding content. This is easy to understand with a simple example. Here I've positioned an inline EM element. First I use the position property to set the method to relative. Then I use the top offset property to move the element 30 pixels down from its initial position and the left property to move it 60 pixels to the right. Okay, remember offset property values move the element away from the specified edge. So if you want something to move to the right, as I did here, you use the left offset property. Okay. You want it to move to the right, left. I want to point out a few things that are happening. The original space in the document flow is preserved. You can see that there is a blank space where the emphasized text would have been if the element had not been positioned. The surrounding content is laid out as though the element was still there, and therefore we say that element still influences the surrounding content. Okay. Overlap happens because this is a positioned element. It can potentially overlap other elements. Right. Okay. The empty space left behind by relatively positioned objects can be a little awkward. So this method is not used as often as absolute positioning. However, relative positioning is common to create a positioning context for an absolutely positioned element. I'll explain in the next section. Absolute positioning. Absolute positioning works a bit differently and is actually a more flexible method for accurately placing elements on the page than relative positioning. Now that you've seen how relative positioning works, let's take the same example as shown. Only this time we'll change the value of the position property to absolute. Okay. So as you can see, the space once occupied by the EM element is now closed up as is the case for all absolutely positioned elements. In its new position, the element box overlaps the surrounding content. In the end, absolutely positioned elements have no influence whatsoever, on the layout of the surrounding element. The most significant difference here, however, is the location of the position mentioned. This time the offset value Alright, so we have this time the offset value position the EM 30 pixels down and 60 pixels to the right from the browser window. But wait, before you start thinking that absolutely positioned elements are always placed relative to the browser window, I'm afraid that there's more to it than that. Okay. What actually happens in absolute positioning is that the element is positioned relative to its nearest containing block. It just so happens that the nearest containing block is the root HTML element, also known as the initial containing block. So the offset values position the element relative to the whole document. Okay. Some browsers base the initial containing block on the body element. The net result is the same that it fills the browser window. Okay. Getting a handle on the containing block concept is the first step to tackling absolute positioning. Containing blocks. The CSS 2.1 recommendation states the position and size of an element's boxes are sometimes calculated relative to a certain rectangle called the containing block of the element. It is critical to have an awareness of the containing block of the element you want to position. Okay. It is critical to have an awareness of the containing block of the element you want to position. We sometimes refer to this as positioning context. Okay, let me go through it again. The CSS 2.1 recommendation states the position and size of an element's boxes are sometimes calculated relative to a certain rectangle called the block containing block of the element. It is critical to have an awareness of the containing block of the element you want to position. We sometimes refer to this as positioning context. The recommendation lays out a number of intricate rules for determining the containing block of an element, but it basically boils down to this. If the positioned element is not contained within another positioned block within with okay if the positioned element is not contained within another positioned element, then it will be placed relative to the initial containing block created by the HTML element. Okay. But if the element has an ancestor that is contained within an element that has its position set to relative, absolute, or fixed, the element will be positioned relative to the edges of that element instead. Okay. So figure 1517 is an example of the first case. The P element that contains the absolutely positioned EM is not positioned itself, and there are no other positioned elements higher in the hierarchy. Therefore, the EM element is positioned relative to the initial containing block, which is equivalent to the browser window area. Let's deliberately turn the P element into a containing block and see what happens. Okay. So we go P is relative. Now what will happen? Okay, all we have to do is apply the position property to it. We don't have to actually move it. The most common way to make an element into a containing block is to set the position to relative. The most common way to make an element into a containing block is to set the position relative, but don't move it with offset values. By the way, this is what I was talking about earlier when I said relative positioning is most often used to create a context for absolutely positioned elements. Okay. We'll keep the style same for EM element the same, but we'll add a position property to P element, thus making it a containing block for the mentioned EM element. Okay. Or to put it another way, the containing block for an absolutely positioned element is the nearest position ancestor element, that is any element with a value for position other than static. Okay. If there is no containing block present, in other words, if the positioned element is not contained within another position element, then the initial containing block created by the HTML element will be used instead. Alright. You can see that EM element is now positioned 30 pixels down and 60 pixels from the top corner of the paragraph box, not the browser window. Notice that it is positioned relative to the padding edge of the paragraph, padding edge, just inside the border, not the content area edge. Okay, this is the normal behavior when block elements are used as containing elements. I'm going to poke around at this some more to reveal additional aspects of absolutely positioned objects. This time I've added width margin properties to the positioned EM element. Okay. When inline elements are used as containing blocks, and they can be, the positioned element is placed relative to the content area edge, not the padding edge. Okay. So we have defined a width and a margin, 25 pixels on all sides. With positioned element. Okay, EM. Oh, right. Okay, so here we can see that the offset values apply to the outer edge of the element from margin edge to margin edge, and absolutely positioned element have behave as block level element. Okay. For example, the margin on all sides are maintained even though this is an inline element. It also permits a width to be set for the element. Width 200. So this total is 200 pixels. Right. It is important to keep in mind that once you've positioned an element, it becomes a new containing block for all the element it contains. Consider this in which a div named content is positioned in the top left corner of the page. When a positioned list item within the div is given offset value that places it in the top right corner, it appears in the top right corner of the div, not the entire page. That is because once the div is positioned, it acts like a containing block. Okay, so I have a div content, then I have list element, and then I have this ID special. Okay, the ogre coating. Okay, so within div content we define absolute and the list item with the ID special is given this. Okay, so it will always stay in the top. Okay, this is absolute at top 0, and this is also given positioned in the top left corner, and this, okay, right 0. All right, so position in the top right corner. Okay, positioned elements become the containing block for elements they contain. In this example, the list item is positioned relative to the containing div element. Okay. Specifying position. Now that you have a better feel for the containing block concept, let's take some time to get better acquainted with the offset properties. So far we've only seen an element moved a few pixels down. So far we've only seen an element moved a few pixels down and to the right. But that's not all you can do, of course. Pixel measurements. As mentioned previously, positive offset values push the okay, as mentioned previously, positive offset values push the positioned element box away from the specified edge and toward the center of the containing block. Right. If there is no, as mentioned previously, positive offset push the positioned element box away from the specified edge and toward the center of. Okay. If there is no value specified for a site, it is set to auto, and the browsers add enough space to make the layout work. In this example, okay, now that you have a better feel for taking work, embedding in your offset property, so far we've only seen an element moved a few pixels down to the right, but that's not all you can do, of course. In this example, I've used pixel length for all four of properties to place the position element at a particular spot in its containing. Okay. So we have a div with id a. So relative creates a containing block. Then div with id p. Top 20, bottom 40. Okay. Notice that by setting offsets on all four sides, I have indirectly set the dimensions of the position div b. Div v, it fills 220 by uh, 60 pixels space that is left over within the containing block after the offset values are applied. Notice that by setting offset on all four sides, I have indirectly set the dimensions of the position div b. It fills 220 by 60 pixel space that is left over within the containing block after the offset value is applied. If I had also specified a width and other box properties for div b, there is the potential for conflicts if the total of the value for position box and its offset do not match the available space. Okay. The CSS specification provides a daunting set of rules for handling conflicts, but the upshot is that you should just be careful not to overspecify box properties and offsets. Okay. Calculated at 220 pixels wide and 60 pixels high. Okay. The setting, I will directly set the dimension of the position to be. Sorry, but border is 1 pixel, position is absolute. Okay, this is 40, this is 60, this is 50, this is 80. So 300 minus 80 is 220. Okay. Let me write. So this is 300 minus 50 minus 30, 220. Then height equals 120 minus 20 minus 40, which is 60. Okay, is that you should just be careful not to over specify box properties and offsets. In general, a width factoring is in optional padding in border margin, and one or two offset properties are all that are necessary to achieve the layout you're looking for. Let the browser take care of the remaining calculation. Percentage values. You can also specify positions with percentage values. In the first example, in figure 15 to 20, the image is positioned halfway down the left of the containing block. Okay. Hmm. Okay. Okay, so it starts at halfway. Right. In the second example on the right, the image is positioned so that it appears in the bottom right. Okay. Huh. Although the examples used here specify both a vertical and horizontal offset, it is common to provide just one offset for a positioned element. For example, to move it to left or right into a margin using either left or right properties. In exercise 15.4, we'll make further changes to Genway homepage, this time using absolute positioning. Okay. In this exercise, we'll use absolute positioning to add an award graphic to the site and to create a two-column layout. Open the pre-exercise 15.3 version of or Genway chapter 15 in the text editor. You should be starting with a single column layout with floated images and horizontal menu. Okay, Genway float pre, right? I think, yeah. Okay, so images are floated. Right. Okay, so I'll just copy this. This is 15.4. Let's open. Okay. Then let's pretend that Genway.com won the Awesome Site of the Week award, and now we have the privilege of displaying a little award banner on the homepage. Because it is new content, we need to add it to the markup. Because it is non-essential information, we'll add the image in a new div at the very end of the document after the copyright paragraph. Okay, non-essential. And content in the body, I'm going to create a new div with id is award. Okay, then we have I create an image. Says awesome site of the week. Okay. Just because it is at the end of the document, so it doesn't mean it needs to be displayed. Okay. Although it is at the end of the source document, but we will display it elsewhere. Okay. So I have image source. Okay, I'll add an image document. This images awesome site dot is it really a GIF file? Awesome site dot GIF. Okay. Awesome site dot gif, and I can provide an alt. Let me close it. And alternate is awesome side of the week. Okay. Awesome side of the week. Okay, now I should see it at the end. Nothing. Oh, because I'm not I haven't opened it yet. Okay, there we go. Awesome side of the week. Right. Okay, just because it is at the end of the source document doesn't mean it needs to display at the bottom of the page. We can use absolute positioning to place award div in the top left corner of the browser window for all to see by adding a new rule to the style sheet that positions div like so. Okay. So we can add for ID award. Okay. For ID award, we can use position absolute, then top is how many pixels? 35 pixels. 35 pixels, and left is 25 pixels. 25 pixels. Let's see, and it disappeared. Okay. It seems to have disappeared. Okay. Position is absolute. Absolute position, yes. Award. Did I mark it up? ID. Right. This div is this div. Award. Then within the style document, I define the award. Save the document and take a look. Resize the browser window very narrow, and you will see that the positioned award overlaps with the header content. Notice that when you scroll the document, the image scrolls with the rest of the page. Oh, is it so? Alright, there it is. What happens? Okay. So if I open it up again, okay, there you go. It does it. Alright. It overlaps. And when we scroll it, does it scroll with the page? No, not really. It does not scroll. It does not really scroll with the page. Okay. When you size the position award image overlaps header content, notice also that when you scroll the document, the image scroll with the rest of the page. Try playing around with other offset properties and a value to get a feel for positioning in the browser window or initial containing block to use correct term. We created two columns with a float. Now let's do the same with the absolute positioning. This time we'll make the testimonials box to fixed width and allow the product box to flex to fill the remaining space. This is just another common layout approach that I want you to get a feel for. Okay. As the document stands now, if we position testimonials div, it will be relative to browser window, which is not what we want. We want it to always appear under the nav div. Okay. Navigation Dev. Okay, testimonials is um, it will be relative to right. Okay, as a document stands now, if we position the testimonials dev, it will be relative to browser window, which is not what we want. We want it to always appear under the nav dev, and we'll start by creating a new containing block after nav that holds the products and testimonial devs and will serve as a new positioning context. This is going to require some changes to the markup. Wrap products and testimonials in into a new ID called acha content. Okay, so product and testimonials div ID content. I already have content. End of content. Okay. I should put it within the. Oh no, but right. Copyright. Okay. Document. This is going to have the structure within content, but the copyright should be outside. Okay. Testimonials dev. So I'll push class equals copyright. We don't have a class copyright. I have a ID of copyright. ID product class is copyright. Okay, now we can turn the div into a containing block simply for positioning it with unmoved. Okay, hold up. Which div is this? Okay, this is the content div. Alright. Enough content. Okay. This should not affect anything. Okay, why isn't it fixed within the HTML award div? I have given the position absolute. Okay. So now we can turn the content div into a containing block by positioning it with unmoved relative position track. Okay. Now content position relative. Content. Okay. Then with that in place, we can position the testimonial box in the top right corner of the content div. Add the position. Okay, add the position as well as the top right properties to testimonials rule. In addition, make the content 14 EMs wide. Okay. Adjust the top margin to 0 and change the left and right margins to 10% to just 1 EM. Okay. If you save the file and take a look in the browser, you should see the testimonials box in the right corner blocked. Okay, so we have right on the right of the product box. Alright. The next step is to put a right margin on the product box to make a space for the testimonials. But how much space? Let's calculate like WebGeeks do. Okay, so this is here. An absolutely positioned about graphic. Okay. Right. So testimonials now. I have to update the testimonials to from margin 1 EM 10% to 0 1 EM. Okay. Margin is 0 1 EM. And then position absolute. Absolute. Then we go top 0 right 0. Okay, top right corner. Top 0 right 0, and then we give a width, fixed width of 14. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Okay, there it is. Right, it is fixed here. Now it is overlapping currently. Okay. If you save the file and take a look in the browser, you should see the testimonials box in the right corner plopped right on top of the products box. The next step is to put a right margin on the product box to make a space for the testimonials. But how much space? Let's calculate like WebGeeks do. Okay. The testimonials box has approximately 3.5 EMs of left padding, 14 EM content, 14 EM wide content, 1 EM of right padding and 1 EM right margin for a total of 19.5 EM. If we make the right margin on product 20.5 EM, that will make space for the testimonials box plus a little space in between the columns. Okay, we'll do it using the treble shorthand. Okay, so we are giving it the space 20.5. Okay, so 14 EM wide content. This is 14 EM wide content, approximately 3.5 EMs of padding and 1 EM of right padding here and 1 EM of right margin. Okay, for a total of 19.5 EMs. Okay, so we update the margin. Product, I have to update the margin to 20.511. 20.5 EM and 1 EM and 1 EM. Okay, let's see. It is padded, right? Okay, so it always, yeah, now it always maintains that padding, right? It automatically tries to resize it according to that. Alright, now save the document and look at it in the browser. Resize the window and compare how the boxes behave compared to previous plotted examples. Okay. Reality tag. Two column format created by absolutely positioning the testimonials box. Reality check. Before you get too excited about the ease of creating multi-column layouts with absolute positioning, let me point out that this exercise represents a best case scenario in which the positioned sidebar column is pretty much guaranteed to be shorter than the main content. There is also no significant footer to worry about. If the sidebar were to grow longer with more testimonials, it would overlap and any full width footer that might be on the page, which is not ideal. Consider this a heads up. There's more to story as we'll see. Okay. We have stacking order. Before we close the book on absolute positioning, okay, how much? Okay, absolute. Then we have fixed positioning. Then test yourself. All right. And then I will have some more. And we have 2 chapters on here and 2 chapters on. Oh, I'm almost at the going to finish the book. Yes, page layout with CSS transitions, animation, then CSS techniques. Alright. Stacking order. Before we close the book on absolute positioning, there is one last related concept that I want to introduce. As we've seen, absolutely positioned elements overlap other elements, so it follows that multiple positioned elements may have the potential to stack up on one another, right? By default, elements stack up in the order in which they appear in the document, but you can change the stacking order with the z-index property. The picture the z-axis as a line that runs perpendicular to the page along as though from the tip of your nose through this page and out the other side. Okay. The value of z-index property is a number, positive or negative. The higher the number, the higher the element will appear in the stack. The lower the number, movies. Okay, alright. Here are 3 paragraph elements, each containing letter, image A, B, C. Okay. So that have been positioned in a way that they overlap on the page. By default, paragraph C would appear on top because it appears last in the source. However, by assigning higher Z index to paragraphs A and B, we can force stack in the preferred order. Okay, so we have markup. A, B and C. Okay, this is the default. Position absolute. We define as okay, and after the Z index, essential Z index, is the index 1, the index 5 and the index 10. Okay. Note that the value of the index do not need to be sequential and they do not need to relate to anything in particular. All that matters is the higher number values position the element higher in the stack. Okay. 10, 5 and 1. Okay, so we change the stacking order with the Z index property. Higher value stack on top of lower level. Alright. Changing this. Okay, to be honest, the Z index property is not often required for most page layouts, but you should know if there it's there if you need it. If you want to guarantee that a positioned element always end up on top, assign it with a high Z index value. Okay. Then we move on to fixed positioning. We've covered relative and absolute positioning, so now it's time to take on the remaining method, fixed positioning. For the most part, okay, have I missed any side notes? I don't think I have. Oh. Okay, be careful when positioning element at the bottom of the initial containing block. Although you may expect it to be positioned at the bottom of the whole page, browsers actually place the element in the bottom corner of the browser window. Results may be unpredictable. If you want something positioned in the bottom corner on a page, put it in a containing block element at the end of the document source and go from there. Okay. Have I missed anything else? I don't think so. Okay. So fixed positioning, we've covered relative positioning and absolute positioning. So now it's time to take on the remaining method, fixed positioning. For the most part, fixed positioning works just like absolute positioning. The significant difference is that offset value of the fixed elements are always relative to the viewport, which means the positioned elements stay put even when the rest of the page scrolls. By contrast, you may remember that when you scrolled the Genware page, the award graphic scrolled along with the document. Even though it was positioned relative to the initial containing block equivalent to browser window, not so fixed with fixed positioning where the position is well fixed. Okay, that's funny. Fixed elements are often used for menus that stay in the same place at the top, bottom, or side of a screen, so they are always visible, even when the content scrolls. Please take a moment to read the sidebar for a heads up on potential problems. Okay. Watch out for fixed position in mobile. The position fixed property causes some quirky behaviors on many mobile browsers as of this writing. Some treat it as merely static, letting it scroll with the rest of the content. Some supporting browsers scroll the fixed element off the screen but snap it back into place when the scrolling stops. At least one browser that at least one browser then miscalculates where it should land, resulting in an awkward user experience. Others cause everything to be jittery. There are some fixes, but they have drawbacks. One solution is to disable the ability for the user to zoom on the page, but that removes a useful usability feature. The other is to use JavaScript solution to create the correct fixed positioning behavior, but that introduces a new level of complexity and potential for incompatible support. The best option is to consider whether you need a fixed element at all for good usability, then explore the JavaScript options as needed. Okay, for a good description of the problems. Alright. So let's switch the award graphic on the Genway to fixed positioning in exercise 15 to see the difference. Okay, this one should be simple. Open the Genway page, style, and absolute to fixed. Okay. Let's open it. Alright, so we need to go to the last where it is testimonials award, right? From absolute. Hold up, let me see that I have changed the value position to fixed, and then if I run it, oh, okay, see, this is always fixed, right? Okay, save the document, open in browser. Okay, now that you've been introduced to all the tools of the trade for CSS based layout, floating in three types of positioning: relative, absolute, and fixed, you should have a good feel for how they work when we start putting them to use in the various design approaches and templates in chapter 16. Okay, so that is it for today.